The rain hammered against the glass windows of Morrison and Associates, a mid-sized accounting firm occupying the 14th floor of a steel and concrete tower in downtown Chicago. It was the kind of relentless November rain that turned the city gray, washing the streets clean while leaving everything feeling colder, emptier. Inside the office, the fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous tune, casting harsh shadows across rows of cubicles where employees typed away, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of computer screens. At the center of it all sat Richard Morrison, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair meticulously combed back, wearing a navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His corner office was a shrine to success. Mahogany desk, leather chairs, framed degrees from Northwestern University, and photographs of him shaking hands with Chicago's elite. Richard had built this firm from the ground up, transforming it from a two-person operation into a thriving business with 32 employees. He was proud, driven, and utterly unforgiving when it came to mistakes. His secretary, Emma Caldwell, sat just outside his office in a small workspace that felt more like a holding cell than a desk. At 28 years old, Emma was the kind of person who seemed to fade into the background. She wore simple clothes, kept her brown hair tied back in a practical ponytail, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. She'd been working for Richard for 3 years, handling his schedule, organizing files, managing correspondence, and essentially keeping his professional life running smoothly. She was efficient, reliable, and invisible, exactly what Richard wanted in an assistant. But today, everything changed. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love hearing from our audience around the world, and if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next gripping tale. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next. It started with an envelope, a simple manila envelope containing documents for the Bergman account, one of the firm's largest clients, a real estate development company worth millions. Richard had given Emma explicit instructions: double-check the tax projections, ensure all signatures were in place, and deliver the envelope to Mr. Bergman's office by 3 o'clock that afternoon. It was a routine task, something Emma had done countless times before, but at 2:45, Richard's phone rang. It was Gerald Bergman himself, his voice sharp with irritation. "Morrison, where are my documents? I have a meeting with investors in 15 minutes, and I'm sitting here empty-handed." Richard's jaw tightened. He glanced through his glass door and saw Emma's empty desk. His pulse quickened with that familiar sensation of anger rising in his chest, the kind that made his vision narrow and his words cut like razors. He hung up the phone without ceremony and marched out of his office, his footsteps heavy on the carpet. Emma returned 10 minutes later, slightly out of breath, her coat damp from the rain. She was carrying a paper bag from the pharmacy down the street. The moment she saw Richard standing by her desk, arms crossed, his face contorted with barely contained fury, her stomach dropped. "Where were you?" His voice was low, controlled, but laced with venom. Emma swallowed hard. "Mr. Morrison, I had to run to the pharmacy. It was urgent. Urgent." Richard cut her off, his voice rising now. "More urgent than the Bergman account? More urgent than your job? Do you have any idea what you've done? Gerald Bergman just called me, humiliated because his documents weren't delivered. Documents that were your responsibility. I'm so sorry, Mr. Morrison. I can take them right now. It's too late." Richard slammed his hand on her desk, making Emma flinch. The entire office had gone silent. Heads turned from cubicles, watching the scene unfold like spectators at an accident. 3 years, Emma. 3 years you've worked here, and this is how you repay me. By sabotaging my reputation. Emma's eyes were wide, her hands trembling slightly. "It wasn't intentional. I had an emergency, and I thought I could. I don't care about your excuses." Richard's voice was ice cold now. "You're fired. Pack your things and get out. I want you gone in 10 minutes. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emma's face went pale, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry, but instead she simply nodded, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Without another word, she turned to her desk and began gathering her belongings. A small framed photograph, a coffee mug with a faded university logo, a cardigan draped over her chair. Richard returned to his office, his heart still pounding with righteous indignation. He didn't look back. He didn't see the way Emma's hands shook as she placed her items in a small cardboard box. He didn't notice when she pulled out a white envelope from her desk drawer, her fingers lingering on it for a moment, before she placed it carefully on his desk while he was on a phone call, his back turned to the door. 10 minutes later, Emma Caldwell walked out of Morrison and Associates for the last time. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into rivers of gray water. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and disappeared into the November afternoon, swallowed by the city's indifferent embrace. Richard spent the rest of the day in a foul mood, barking orders at his remaining staff and personally delivering the Bergman documents with an apology that tasted like ash in his mouth. Gerald accepted it graciously enough, but Richard could feel the shift, the subtle loss of respect, the crack in his carefully constructed image. It gnawed at him. By 6 o'clock, the office had emptied. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and the city lights below twinkled like distant stars. Richard sat alone in his office, loosening his tie and pouring himself a glass of scotch from the crystal decanter on his credenza. He told himself he'd made the right decision. Emma had been careless, unprofessional. There was no room for such failures in his firm. That's when he noticed it. The white envelope on his desk, propped against his desk lamp. His name was written on it in Emma's neat, careful handwriting, Mr. Morrison. Richard frowned. He didn't remember seeing it there before. He set down his glass and picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. It was sealed, but not with any particular care, just a simple lick of the adhesive. For a moment, he considered throwing it away without opening it. What could Emma possibly have to say to him now? An apology? A bitter accusation? Curiosity won. He slid his letter opener under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. As he unfolded it, something else slipped out and fell onto his desk, a photograph. Richard picked it up first. It was a picture of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with bright eyes and a missing front tooth, grinning at the camera. She was wearing a hospital gown, sitting in a bed with colorful blankets, surrounded by stuffed animals. Behind her, barely visible in the background, was Emma, younger, thinner, but unmistakably her, holding the girl's hand. Richard's frown deepened. He set the photograph down and began to read the letter. Dear Mr. Morrison, by the time you read this, I'll already be gone. So I hope you'll allow me a moment to explain what happened today. I know you don't owe me anything, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I think you deserve to know the truth. The emergency that took me away from the office this afternoon wasn't a casual errand or a selfish mistake. I received a call from Chicago Memorial Hospital. My younger sister, Lily, is 7 years old, and she's been battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia for the past 2 years. Today, her condition took a sudden turn. Her white blood cell count dropped dangerously low, and she developed a severe infection. The doctors needed me to authorize an emergency transfusion and sign consent forms because our parents died in a car accident 4 years ago. I'm her legal guardian. I thought I could make it to the hospital and back in time to deliver the Bergman documents. I was wrong. I'm sorry for that. I know it cost you professionally, and I know it cost me my job. I accept that. But I want you to know something, Mr. Morrison. For 3 years, I've worked for you without complaint. I've stayed late when you needed me, come in early when you asked, and sacrificed my own time and energy to make sure your life ran smoothly. I've never asked for special treatment or made excuses, but today I had to choose between my job and my sister's life. I chose her. I will always choose her. I don't expect you to understand. You've built an empire on discipline and high standards, and I respect that. But I hope one day you'll realize that behind every employee, every assistant, every person who works for you, there's a whole life you know nothing about. We all have battles you can't see. The girl in the photograph is Lily. She's the reason I get up every morning. She's the reason I work as hard as I do. And today, she needed me more than you did. I wish you and the firm nothing but success. Sincerely, Emma Caldwell. Richard's hands were shaking. He read the letter again, slower this time, each word sinking deeper into his consciousness like stones into water. His eyes kept drifting back to the photograph, the little girl with the missing tooth, the hospital bed, Emma's hand holding hers. He set the letter down on his desk and leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. The scotch sat untouched, forgotten. The rain outside seemed louder now, each drop against the window a small accusation. Richard pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to process what he'd just learned. Emma had a sister, a sick sister, a dying sister for all he knew, and he'd fired her without hesitation, without asking a single question, without giving her even a moment to explain. He'd stood in front of the entire office and humiliated her, calling her careless and unprofessional, all while she was dealing with something he couldn't even begin to imagine. For the first time in years, Richard Morrison felt something he'd carefully insulated himself against: shame. Deep, burning, suffocating shame. He thought about the 3 years Emma had worked for him. Had he ever asked her about her life? Had he ever inquired about her family, her struggles, her dreams? He couldn't remember a single personal conversation. To him, she'd been a function, not a person. A tool to make his life easier, to keep his schedule organized, to handle the mundane tasks he didn't want to deal with. And today, when she'd needed understanding, when she'd faced an impossible choice between her job and her family, he'd chosen cruelty. He'd chosen his pride, his reputation, his anger over any semblance of human compassion. Richard picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. He pulled up Emma's contact information. He'd never deleted it. It was nearly 7 o'clock now. Where would she be? The hospital, probably. Sitting by her sister's bedside, wondering how she was going to pay her bills now that she'd lost her job. He needed to fix this. But how? An apology felt woefully inadequate. Simply rehiring her felt transactional, hollow. What could he possibly do to make this right? Richard stood up abruptly, grabbing his coat from the stand by the door. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he couldn't sit in this office any longer, surrounded by his accomplishments and accolades, knowing what he'd done. He locked up the office and headed for the elevator, the letter and photograph clutched in his hand. The drive to Chicago Memorial Hospital took 20 minutes through rain-slicked streets. Richard's mind raced the entire way, rehearsing and discarding a dozen different approaches. What would he say? How could he possibly explain his actions? More importantly, how could he help? The hospital lobby was bright and sterile, filled with the smell of antiseptic and the quiet murmur of worried families. Richard approached the reception desk, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked in his expensive suit, dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor. "I'm looking for a patient," he said to the young woman behind the desk. "Lily Caldwell. She was admitted today for—" He paused, realizing he didn't know the details. "For a blood transfusion. Emergency." The receptionist typed on her computer, her face neutral. "Pediatric oncology. 5th floor, room 512. Visiting hours end at 8, so you should have time." Richard thanked her and made his way to the elevator, his heart pounding harder with each floor he ascended. When the doors opened on the 5th floor, he was greeted by walls painted in cheerful pastels, decorated with cartoon characters and motivational posters. It was a stark contrast to the gravity of what happened here. Room 512 was at the end of a long hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Richard could see Emma sitting in a chair beside a hospital bed. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, her posture slumped with the weight of the day. In the bed, a small figure lay sleeping, connected to various monitors and an IV drip. Richard knocked softly on the doorframe. Emma's head snapped up, and when she saw him, her expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something like dread. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, standing up. "What are you doing here?" Richard stepped into the room, removing his coat. He felt utterly out of his depth. "I read your letter," he said, his voice rough. "I saw the photograph." Emma's hand instinctively moved to touch her sister's bedside. A protective gesture. "You didn't need to come here. I understand why you fired me. I accept it." "No," Richard said, shaking his head. "No, you don't understand. I came here to apologize." Emma blinked, clearly not expecting those words. Richard moved closer but kept a respectful distance. "I had no idea what you were dealing with, Emma. None. And that's not your fault. It's mine. In 3 years, I never once asked about your life. I never saw you as a person, just as someone who worked for me. And today, when you needed understanding, I gave you cruelty instead." Emma's eyes were glistening now, but she remained silent. "I can't take back what I said or how I treated you," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can tell you this, you were right. Behind every person who works for me, there's a life I know nothing about. And I've been so focused on building my firm, on maintaining my reputation, that I forgot the most important thing, the people who make it all possible." He paused, looking at the little girl in the bed. Even asleep, with tubes and monitors surrounding her, she had a peaceful expression on her face. "Your sister," Richard said softly. "How is she?" Emma swallowed hard. "The transfusion helped. The infection is under control for now, but it's a constant battle. Every day is uncertain." Richard nodded slowly. "Emma, I want you to come back to work. But more than that, I want you to know that if you need time off for Lily, for appointments, for emergencies, you'll have it. No questions asked. And I want to help with the medical bills. I know this kind of treatment is expensive, and Mr. Morrison," Emma interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Richard said, "but I want to. Let me do something right for once." For a long moment, Emma just looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. Then slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." Richard felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I'm the one who should be thanking you," he said, "for teaching me something I should have learned a long time ago." They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft beeping of Lily's monitors and the rain pattering against the window. It wasn't a perfect resolution, Nothing could erase what had happened that day, but it was a beginning, a chance for Richard to become something more than the cold, driven businessman he'd allowed himself to become. As he prepared to leave, giving Emma space to be with her sister, the little girl stirred in her bed. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at Emma with a sleepy smile. "Is that your boss?" Lily asked in a small voice, glancing at Richard. Emma smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her sister's forehead. "Yes, sweetie. This is Mr. Morrison." Lily looked at Richard with curious eyes. "Are you the one who makes my sister work so hard?" Richard felt his throat tighten. He moved closer to the bed and knelt down so he was at eye level with the little girl. "I used to be," he said honestly, "but I'm going to do better. I promise." Lily seemed satisfied with that answer. She gave him a small smile before closing her eyes again, drifting back to sleep. Richard stood and met Emma's gaze. There were tears streaming down her face now, but she was smiling. A genuine, grateful smile that made Richard realize just how much he'd been missing in his single-minded pursuit of success. "I'll see you Monday," he asked softly. Emma nodded. "I'll be there." Richard left the hospital that night with the rain still falling, but somehow the city didn't seem as gray anymore. The weight of the envelope and the letter in his pocket felt different now, not like a burden, but like a reminder that behind every person he encountered, there was a story he didn't know, a struggle he couldn't see, a life as complex and meaningful as his own. The next morning, Richard arrived at the office earlier than usual. He spent an hour going through employee files, not looking at performance metrics or attendance records, but at the personal information section, emergency contacts, family members, notes about circumstances. How many other stories had he missed? How many other people were fighting battles he knew nothing about? When Emma returned to work on Monday, she found her desk exactly as she'd left it, but with a small addition, a new framed photograph of Lily, alongside a card signed by every employee in the office, wishing her sister a speedy recovery. Richard had also arranged for a flexible schedule and partnered with the firm's health insurance to ensure Lily's treatments were fully covered. But more importantly, Richard changed. He started having coffee with his employees, asking about their families, their challenges, their lives outside the office. He implemented a new policy allowing personal emergency time without penalty, and he never again made the mistake of judging someone's actions without first understanding their circumstances. Years later, when Richard would tell this story, and he told it often, especially to new hires, he would always say the same thing. That envelope didn't just contain an explanation. It contained a lesson I desperately needed to learn. We're all fighting battles others can't see, and the measure of our character isn't found in our successes or our achievements, but in how we treat people when they're at their most vulnerable. Emma Caldwell continued to work for Morrison and Associates for many years. Lily beat her cancer and grew into a healthy, vibrant teenager with dreams of becoming a doctor. And Richard Morrison, the man who once cared only about his reputation and his firm, learned that the greatest success isn't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the lives we touch and the compassion we show to those who need it most. Sometimes, it takes a single envelope, a single moment of truth, to change everything. For Richard Morrison, that moment came on a rainy November afternoon when he finally saw the person behind the job title, the human being behind the function. And in that recognition, he found something more valuable than all his professional achievements combined: his humanity. The rain eventually stopped. The city continued its relentless rhythm, but in one corner office on the 14th floor of a steel and concrete tower in downtown Chicago, something fundamental had shifted. Richard Morrison had learned that true leadership isn't about demanding perfection from others. It's about extending grace when they fall short, understanding when they struggle, and recognizing that every person who walks through your door carries a world of experiences you know nothing about. And sometimes, all it takes is an envelope to remind us of that truth.